Welcome to the complete history of the United States of America, a powerful journey from revolution and independence to civil war, world wars, civil rights, and modern challenges. Discover how America grew from 13 colonies into a global superpower, shaped by freedom, struggle, innovation, and resilience. The full story of the United States, told in one epic narrative. Before there was a nation called the United States of America, before a single colonist raised a flag or a musket, before words like liberty and independence were spoken in English on this soil, the land itself already held stories stretching back thousands of years. This continent, vast and varied, carried forests, rivers, plains, deserts, and mountains that shaped the lives of countless peoples long before Europeans ever imagined it. To understand America, we must begin not with its founding fathers, but with its first inhabitants, the indigenous nations who lived, farmed, hunted, built, worshipped, and dreamed here since time immemorial. The landscapes themselves were immense. To the north stretched frozen tundra and forests that seemed endless. To the west, mountain ranges cut like spines against the sky, with rivers carving deep canyons and valleys. In the center, plains rolled outward, seas of grass that carried herds of bison in numbers that seemed infinite. In the south, deserts bloomed with cactus and stone, their skies so wide and clear that stars seemed closer to the ground. Along the eastern seaboard, dense forests reached to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, filled with deer, bear, and countless streams. This geography mattered, for it shaped how humans lived and how their civilizations thrived. Indigenous peoples were not scattered tribes of chance survivors. They were communities with rich cultures, languages, traditions, and sciences. Along the Mississippi River rose great mound-building civilizations, such as Cahokia, whose earthworks and plazas once rivaled the cities of Europe. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings and stone villages, their architecture aligned with the movements of the sun and stars. Along the Pacific coast, great cedar houses sheltered families whose lives were tied to salmon runs and ocean trade. In the northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy created a system of governance that balanced clans and nations, its ideas of unity and council influencing political thought centuries later. Across the Great Plains, nomadic nations followed the rhythm of bison herds, crafting societies centered on mobility, kinship, and ritual. Each of these societies carried knowledge of the land that Europeans would not understand for generations. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash, crops so vital that they spread across continents and sustained entire civilizations. They knew the medicinal uses of plants, the migration patterns of animals, the cycles of rivers and seasons. Their oral histories preserved myths, laws, and memory, passed down through generations with care. These were not people waiting to be discovered. They were nations in their own right, with leaders, artisans, warriors, farmers, and philosophers. When cannon fire thundered across Charleston Harbor in April 1861, the United States shattered. Fort Sumter fell under Confederate guns, and the uneasy balance between North and South collapsed into war. What followed would become the bloodiest conflict in American history, a struggle not only over territory, but over the very meaning of the Republic. Brothers faced brothers, neighbors turned against neighbors, and entire communities were torn apart. The Civil War was both a military contest and a moral reckoning, and its outcome would decide whether the nation founded on liberty could survive its deepest contradiction. At the war's beginning, few believed it would last long. Both North and South imagined a swift campaign, a few battles fought, and a decisive victory won. Young men marched off in uniforms with drums and banners, cheered by townsfolk who believed they would return in weeks. But the scale of the conflict quickly became clear. The Confederacy, made up of 11 seceded states, claimed its independence, defending slavery as its foundation. The Union, led by Abraham Lincoln, fought to preserve the nation, at first to keep the states united, and eventually to redefine freedom itself. The war's geography spanned thousands of miles. Armies clashed in Virginia's rolling hills, in Tennessee's forests, along the Mississippi River, and on distant plains. Naval blockades stretched along the South's coast, strangling trade. Battles were fought not only by soldiers, but in fields, towns, and farms where civilians endured hunger, raids, and fear. The war consumed everything, pulling entire populations into its orbit. Early battles shocked both sides. At Bull Run, near Washington, D.C., Union troops clashed with Confederates in July 1861. Expecting an easy victory, Northern crowds gathered to watch, only to witness chaos and retreat as the Union Army fled. The myth of a quick war died that day, replaced by grim recognition of what lay ahead. Each side mobilized for a longer fight, raising larger armies, building railroads for supply, and preparing for a war of endurance. The Union held advantages in industry, manpower, and navy. Northern factories produced rifles, cannons, and uniforms at a pace the South could not match. Railroads moved troops and supplies more effectively. The Union Navy's blockade cut the South from international trade, choking its economy. Yet the Confederacy fought on with fierce resolve, defending its land and relying on the skill of generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, who turned smaller forces into formidable opponents. The South believed that if it could hold out long enough, foreign powers like Britain or France might intervene on its behalf. Leadership mattered deeply. Abraham Lincoln, steady and thoughtful, carried the Union through dark times, balancing political factions, managing generals, and articulating a vision of national purpose. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, struggled with unity among states that prized independence even as they fought for collective survival. In the North, generals came and went, some cautious, some reckless, until Ulysses S. Grant emerged with the determination and strategic vision to match Lee's brilliance. The war was as much a contest of leadership as of arms. The human cost grew unbearable. Battles like Antietam in 1862 left fields soaked in blood, with over 20,000 casualties in a single day, the deadliest in American history. Gettysburg in 1863 stretched across 3 days, leaving more than 50,000 dead or wounded, entire towns turned into graveyards and hospitals. Soldiers faced not only bullets and cannon fire, but disease, infection, and starvation. Camps became breeding grounds for illness, claiming more lives than combat. Letters home carried words of longing, fear, and resignation, as families waited for news that often never came. For enslaved people, the war brought both danger and hope. At first, Lincoln insisted the war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. But as the conflict deepened, the link between slavery and rebellion became undeniable. Enslaved men and women fled plantations, seeking refuge behind Union lines. Their presence forced the issue. Could the Union fight to preserve the nation while ignoring the freedom of those who had built it? In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. Though it did not end slavery everywhere, it transformed the war into a struggle for freedom. Black men joined the Union Army in large numbers, fighting bravely in battles like Fort Wagner, their service a testament to courage and a claim to citizenship. The war reached into every home. Women in the North and South took on roles once closed to them, managing farms, businesses, and households while husbands and sons were away. Many served as nurses, tending the wounded in makeshift hospitals. Some disguised themselves as men to fight in battle. Others organized relief efforts, raised money, and wrote letters that sustained soldiers' spirits. Civilians endured shortages, inflation, and fear, yet their resilience kept the war effort alive. By 1864, the war's weight pressed hardest on the Confederacy. Union armies pushed deeper into Southern territory, seizing the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia left a trail of destruction, burning crops, railroads, and cities in a strategy of total war aimed at breaking the South's will. Lee's army, though skilled, was worn down by losses, its supplies dwindling. The Union, though battered, had the resources to endure. In April 1865, the end came at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrendered to Grant. The moment was solemn, marked by dignity rather than triumph. Grant offered generous terms, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home rather than face humiliation. For 4 years, the nation had torn itself apart. Now, at last, the guns fell silent. The cost was staggering. More than 600,000 Americans had died, more than in any other conflict in the nation's history. Cities lay in ruins, families shattered, fields abandoned. The war had preserved the Union, but at a price few could have imagined in 1861. Slavery, the great contradiction at the heart of the Republic, had been struck down, though the struggle for true freedom and equality was far from over. Lincoln did not live to guide the peace. Days after victory, he was assassinated in Washington, struck down in a theater by John Wilkes Booth. His death left the nation stunned, mourning the leader who had carried it through its greatest trial. His words at Gettysburg, promising a new birth of freedom, lingered as a vision, but his absence left a void that would haunt the years of Reconstruction. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's Civil War reminds us of something deeper. A republic cannot survive half free and half enslaved. The war between brothers was more than a struggle of armies. It was a test of whether liberty and unity could survive their contradictions. Out of blood and fire, the Union endured, scarred but alive, its ideals reshaped, its destiny forever altered. The United States had been torn apart and sewn back together, stitched with sacrifice, and bound by the promise that freedom, once proclaimed, must belong to all. When Norse sailors touched the shores of North America around the year 1000, their brief presence left little trace. But for centuries afterward, the continent remained part of its own rhythm, untouched by the great upheavals of Europe. Life here continued in cycles of planting, hunting, gathering, trading, and worship. Networks of exchange stretched across the land, from the turquoise of the southwest to the shells of the Atlantic, from copper mined in the Great Lakes to obsidian blades from volcanic regions. Trade routes bound nations together long before highways or railroads, carrying not only goods but stories, songs, and ideas. Yet life was not free of hardship or conflict. Nations clashed in war, raided for resources or captives, and suffered through droughts and famines. Like all human societies, they faced challenges, but their resilience was extraordinary. They adapted to shifting climates, built alliances, and reimagined their lives across centuries. This was a continent already alive with history when the sails of European ships first appeared on the horizon. The arrival of Europeans did not mark the beginning of America's story, but it marked the beginning of profound change. The early explorers saw the continent as a vast wilderness, yet every field they crossed, every path they walked, had been shaped by human hands. Forests were managed through controlled burns. Rivers were fished and dammed with skill. Fields of maize stretched in ordered rows, the result of centuries of agricultural knowledge. To the Europeans, this seemed wild. To the indigenous peoples, it was home, managed with deep understanding of balance and renewal. The meeting of these worlds was unequal from the start. Europeans carried steel, gunpowder, and horses, technologies unknown in the Americas. More devastatingly, they carried diseases for which indigenous peoples had no immunity. Smallpox, influenza, measles, and other plagues swept through villages, killing millions, often before Europeans themselves arrived in those regions. Whole nations collapsed under waves of illness, their elders and knowledge lost in the span of years. What had been a continent alive with civilizations became, in many places, lands emptied by invisible killers. This tragedy would shape every future encounter, tilting power toward newcomers who might otherwise have struggled to survive. But before those calamities, before colonization and conquest, there was simply the land and its people, living in harmony and conflict, creating stories that still echo today. To imagine America's beginnings is to imagine standing on a riverbank centuries ago, hearing the splash of fish, the laughter of children, the voices of elders telling stories by firelight. It is to see the smoke of villages rising from plains, the glow of fires flickering in cliff dwellings, the rhythm of drums echoing in forests. It is to know that this continent was not empty, not waiting, but alive with culture and meaning. Later generations would often erase or diminish these truths, writing histories that began with explorers' voyages or colonial settlements. But to start the story, there is to miss its foundation. For tens of thousands of years, people lived here, adapted here, dreamed here. Their memory remains in the mounds, in the pottery, in the languages still spoken, in the nations that endure despite centuries of pressure. To tell the story of the United States truthfully, one must begin with them, not as background, but as the first chapters of the American epic. The guns had fallen silent, the flags of surrender furled, and the Union stood preserved, but victory in war did not mean peace in the land. The end of the Civil War in 1865 marked not a final chapter, but a beginning filled with questions, bitterness, and fragile hopes. What would freedom mean for the millions of men, women, and children emerging from slavery? How would the South, devastated and resentful, be brought back into the Union? Could a republic torn apart by war truly be mended? Reconstruction, as the era came to be known, was a time of rebuilding and reckoning, a struggle not only to restore buildings and fields, but to decide the meaning of liberty, equality, and citizenship in America. The South lay in ruins. Cities like Richmond, Atlanta, and Charleston had been bombarded, their buildings burned, their streets broken. Railroads were twisted into knots of useless iron, plantations left fallow, fields stripped bare. Families mourned dead sons and fathers, graves fresh in every county. Economies that had once thrived on cotton exports and enslaved labor collapsed overnight. Millions of formerly enslaved people were free in name, but without land, resources, or protection, freedom was precarious. White Southerners faced the shock of defeat, the humiliation of occupation, and the loss of a system they had once defended as their lifeblood. Into this landscape of destruction and uncertainty stepped the federal government, burdened with the task of shaping what would follow. For Abraham Lincoln, Reconstruction had been imagined as a process of healing. In his second inaugural address, delivered only weeks before his death, he spoke of binding the nation's wounds with malice toward none, with charity for all. His vision was one of reconciliation, bringing Southern states back into the Union quickly, with minimal punishment. But Lincoln's assassination shattered that possibility. His successor, Andrew Johnson, a Tennessean who had remained loyal to the Union, tried to implement a lenient plan. Johnson restored Southern government swiftly, pardoned former Confederates, and allowed states to set up legislatures with little oversight. To him, Reconstruction meant reunion, not transformation. But in practice, Johnson's approach betrayed the newly freed population. Southern legislatures, dominated by former Confederates, passed black codes, laws designed to control African Americans and force them back into systems resembling slavery. These codes restricted movement, limited employment, and enforced harsh punishments for supposed vagrancy. Violence erupted, as white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan formed, using terror, beatings, and lynchings to maintain racial hierarchy. To freed people who had imagined freedom as dignity and autonomy, it seemed as though the old order was reasserting itself in new clothing. Congress, particularly the radical Republicans, rejected Johnson's leniency. They believed the war had been fought not only to preserve the Union, but to destroy slavery's legacy. Reconstruction, in their eyes, must mean more than reunion. It must mean transformation. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, declaring all persons born in the United States to be citizens, regardless of race. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, enshrined equal protection under the law, forbidding states from denying rights to any citizen. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, extended the right to vote to black men. These were extraordinary steps, embedding the principles of liberty and equality into the Constitution itself. For a time, these promises seemed real. Under federal protection, freed people built new lives. Schools rose across the South, many funded by the Freedmen's Bureau, where children and adults alike learned to read and write. Churches flourished, becoming centers of community, education, and political life. Black men were elected to local offices, state legislatures, and even Congress. Figures like Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce took seats in the Senate, representing a vision of democracy that seemed revolutionary. Families, once torn apart by slavery, reunited when possible, seeking land, autonomy, and dignity. For a brief moment, the South saw a flowering of possibility, a glimpse of what a multiracial democracy might look like. But the backlash was swift and violent. White Southerners, enraged by their loss of power, resisted Reconstruction at every turn. Paramilitary groups attacked freed people and their allies, burning schools, murdering teachers, intimidating voters. In elections, violence was often the deciding factor, with mobs ensuring that white supremacists regained power. Northern support for Reconstruction wavered as fatigue set in, and economic crises shifted priorities. Corruption scandals in government provided fuel for critics who claimed Reconstruction was misguided and wasteful. The federal commitment to enforcing equality weakened, leaving freed people increasingly vulnerable. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction was unraveling. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved a contested presidential election, effectively ended federal intervention in the South. Troops were withdrawn, and white-controlled governments, known as Redeemers, regained dominance. They quickly dismantled Reconstruction reforms, enacting laws and practices that disenfranchised black voters, segregated public life, and entrenched white supremacy for generations. The hope of true equality faded into the shadow of Jim Crow. And yet, Reconstruction left legacies that could not be erased. The amendments passed during that era, the 13th abolishing slavery, the 14th granting citizenship, the 15th protecting voting rights, remained in the Constitution, waiting to be claimed by later generations. The schools, churches, and communities built by freed people endured, preserving dignity and strength. The memory of black men serving in government, of children learning in classrooms, of families reunited in freedom, carried forward as proof that another America was possible. Reconstruction was a time of reckoning as much as rebuilding. It forced the nation to confront what freedom truly meant. Was liberty simply the absence of chains, or was it the presence of opportunity, dignity, and equality? Could a republic born in revolution and scarred by slavery live up to its own promises? The answers were contested in courthouses, legislatures, fields, and streets, written in blood and ink, in progress and betrayal. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's Reconstruction reminds us that freedom is never simple, never secure, never uncontested. The nation emerged from war with a chance to build something new, and for a brief time, it tried. It glimpsed the possibility of a democracy where race did not define citizenship. That vision was beaten back, but it was not extinguished. It lived on in amendments, in communities, in memory. Reconstruction was unfinished, a fragile experiment within the fragile experiment, and its reckoning continues still. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the deepest truth of this land is that it was never empty, never without meaning, never without people. The United States rose on foundations older than its own name, older than its constitution, older than the very language in which its history is often told. The memory of those who came first, their civilizations, their knowledge, and their resilience forms the silent prologue to the nation that would follow. To remember them is not only history, it is respect, acknowledgement, and the truest beginning of America's story. When sails first appeared on the horizon of the Atlantic, they brought with them more than ships. They carried entire worlds, cultures, technologies, languages, and ambitions that would collide with the peoples already living on the continent. The age of arrival was not a single moment, but a series of encounters, stretching over centuries, in which explorers, settlers, enslaved Africans, and indigenous nations reshaped the destiny of a land that would one day be called the United States. To walk through this chapter of history is to hear the creak of wooden masts, the crack of muskets, the cries of traders, the hymns of missionaries, and the silence left behind by plagues that emptied villages. The Norse may have touched the northern coasts centuries earlier, their settlements in Vinland brief and quickly abandoned. But the real tide of arrival came with the great voyages of European exploration in the late 15th and 16th centuries. Columbus, sailing west under the Spanish crown in 1492, opened routes that brought Spain, France, England, Portugal, and the Netherlands into fierce competition for lands across the Atlantic. The Caribbean became the first testing ground, where indigenous peoples were enslaved, gold was seized, and plantations began to rise. From these islands, ships pushed north and west, tracing coastlines, mapping rivers, and imagining new empires. The first European footprints on what would become the United States came from Spain. Conquistadors marched through Florida, the Gulf Coast, the deserts of the Southwest, leaving behind missions, forts, and trails of conflict. Hernando de Soto's expedition in the 1540s wandered through the southeast, clashing with indigenous peoples and spreading deadly disease. Coronado's forces roamed the plains and deserts in search of mythical cities of gold, finding instead pueblos and bison. These early Spanish ventures brought Catholic missionaries, soldiers, and settlers who planted seeds of empire, but also of resistance, as indigenous nations pushed back against encroachment. The French arrived not with armies of conquest, but with traders and priests. They moved down the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi, forging alliances with native nations and building a network of fur trade that stretched across vast distances. Jesuit missionaries learned local languages, recorded observations, and sought conversions. French presence was light compared to the Spanish, but their influence was deep, leaving legacies in place, names, trade routes, and cultural ties that still echo in Louisiana and Quebec. The English came later, but with ambitions that would shape the future most profoundly. Early attempts at colonization, like Roanoke in the 1580s, vanished into mystery. But in 1607, Jamestown was planted in Virginia, a fragile settlement struggling against famine, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. It survived only through adaptation, the cultivation of tobacco, and the arrival of waves of new settlers. Alongside Jamestown, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620, seeking religious refuge and establishing another fragile foothold. These English colonies began small, but they multiplied rapidly, their populations growing through migration and natural increase, their economies tied to both land and labor. And into this mix came the most tragic arrivals, enslaved Africans. In 1619, a Dutch ship brought the first recorded Africans to Virginia, traded as laborers, soon to become enslaved in a system that grew into the backbone of the colonial economy. From the beginning, the history of America was entwined with forced migration, with human beings torn from their homelands, chained into ships, and sold into lives of bondage. Their arrival was as foundational as that of any settler, shaping culture, economy, and conflict in ways that would reverberate for centuries. For indigenous nations, these arrivals were not a single wave, but a series of relentless intrusions. Each European ship meant new diseases, new demands for land, new disruptions of trade. Villages that had thrived for centuries found themselves emptied by epidemics of smallpox and influenza. Leaders who once balanced alliances with neighboring nations now faced foreign powers who shifted the balance of power with weapons and goods. Some nations forged treaties, trading furs for muskets or cloth. Others fought bitter wars to defend their lands. Still others were caught between rival empires, forced into choices that could never truly protect them. The age of arrival was also an age of misunderstanding. Europeans saw the land as wilderness, waiting to be claimed, while indigenous peoples knew it as a lived-in, managed environment, rich with meaning. Europeans spoke of discovery, but to the nations already here, it was intrusion. Missionaries spoke of salvation, but to those who followed their traditions, it was erasure. Each side struggled to make sense of the other, often with tragic consequences. The gap between cultures was immense, yet moments of exchange, shared meals, traded goods, mixed marriages, created fragile bridges amid the storms of conquest. Settlement spread unevenly. Along the coast, small towns grew into colonies, their wooden houses clustered around churches and meeting halls. Inland, frontiers expanded slowly, as forests were cut, fields planted, and forts raised. Spanish missions dotted the southwest, their bells calling both settlers and converts. French forts rose along rivers, anchoring trade routes. English colonies multiplied, from New England's rocky shores to the plantations of the Carolinas. Each settlement carried with it not just people but laws, customs, and ambitions, creating patchworks of culture that would eventually knit into a nation. The Atlantic itself became a highway, carrying not only settlers, but goods and ideas. Ships carried tobacco, rice, furs, and timber eastward, while manufactured goods, enslaved people, and wealth flowed westward. This Atlantic world bound Europe, Africa, and the Americas together in trade, conflict, and cultural exchange. The age of arrival was not only about physical migration, but about the weaving of continents into a single web, one that shaped everything from diets to languages to politics. Yet for all its ambition, the age of arrival was precarious. Colonies nearly starved, settlers died in droves, and indigenous resistance forced many to abandon their claims. Diseases swept through camps, winters froze crops, and rival empires clashed in wars that stretched across oceans. The creation of new communities was always fragile, always uncertain. And yet, despite failures, the arrivals continued, wave after wave, until the fabric of the continent was forever altered. To stand at this threshold of history is to see two worlds colliding, one ancient and rooted, the other restless and expanding. It is to hear the clash of steel and the cry of drums, the rustle of cornfields beside the toll of church bells, the chanting of prayers in Latin alongside the songs of native languages. The age of arrival was not a beginning so much as a transformation, a turning point where the destiny of millions was rewritten by the arrival of ships on distant shores. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's age of arrival shows us something eternal, that migration, encounter, and conflict shape the fate of peoples. The United States would not emerge fully formed. It would grow out of these first encounters, this mingling of worlds, this collision of dreams and tragedies. The sails that appeared on the horizon carried not only settlers, but the seeds of a nation, planted in soil already rich with history, watered with both hope, and when people today speak of the original colonies, they often imagine a single community, 13 pieces that fit neatly into the puzzle of a future nation. But the truth was more complicated. In the 17th and 18th centuries, each colony was its own world, carrying its own laws, faiths, economies, and ambitions. To walk through the colonies in those years was not to see a unified America waiting to be born, but a collection of societies, distinct and sometimes in conflict, bound together only loosely by the thread of British rule. New England, to the north, was shaped most strongly by religion. The Pilgrims of Plymouth and the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay came seeking refuge from persecution, determined to build communities rooted in faith. Their towns grew around meeting houses where sermons lasted for hours and daily life was measured against Scripture. Education flourished early, for children were expected to read the Bible, and Harvard College was founded within decades to train ministers. Yet even here, unity was fragile. Dissenters like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson challenged authority and were driven out, leading to the creation of Rhode Island, a colony more tolerant of difference. Connecticut grew with its own mix of settlers, while New Hampshire took shape further north. These colonies were tight-knit, marked by town meetings and small farms, but they also carried a rigidity that punished deviation and bred tensions with those who lived differently. To the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, the story looked different. Here, diversity was the rule. New York had begun as a Dutch colony, its culture shaped by commerce, trade, and tolerance before it passed into English hands. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn and his fellow Quakers, became a haven of religious freedom, attracting not only Quakers, but Germans, Scots-Irish, and others who sought liberty and land. These colonies became centers of trade, their ports bustling with ships that carried grain, furs, and timber to markets across the Atlantic. Philadelphia, with its broad streets and thriving press, grew into one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the colonies. The middle colonies blended agriculture with commerce, tolerance with ambition, and became crossroads where cultures mingled in ways that foreshadowed the wider nation to come. Further south, the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland built economies on tobacco, a crop so profitable that it transformed society. Large plantations grew, worked by enslaved Africans whose labor was brutally extracted to feed the hunger of European markets. Virginia, the oldest English colony, developed an elite class of planters who dominated politics and wealth, while small farmers and indentured servants struggled for survival on the margins. Maryland, founded initially as a refuge for Catholics, became similarly reliant on tobacco and slavery. The Chesapeake was a place of opportunity for some and of deep exploitation for others, its fields soaked with both ambition and suffering. Still further south, the Carolinas and Georgia grew differently again. In South Carolina, rice and indigo plantations spread across the coastal lowlands, creating one of the wealthiest and most rigid slave societies in the colonies. Charleston became a vibrant port city, connected not only to England, but to the Caribbean, where sugar and slavery created immense fortunes. North Carolina developed more slowly, with smaller farms and less hierarchy, but it too depended heavily on enslaved labor. Georgia, founded later in the 1730s, was originally imagined as a colony for debtors and a buffer against Spanish Florida, but it quickly joined the plantation economy. In these southern colonies, wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority of people, enslaved or poor, carried the burdens. Despite their differences, all 13 colonies shared certain threads. They were tied to Britain by loyalty to the crown, by trade that flowed across the Atlantic, and by legal systems that echoed English law. They were defended by British soldiers, supplied by British merchants, and taxed by British policies. They also shared tensions with indigenous nations as settlers pushed westward into lands already inhabited and defended. The frontier was a place of both opportunity and violence, where colonists expanded and indigenous peoples resisted, shaping the boundaries of colonial life. The colonies also shared an underlying spirit of independence, even if it was not yet directed against Britain. Settlers governed themselves in local assemblies, ran their own churches, and adapted laws to local needs. Distance from London made direct control difficult, and colonists grew used to managing their affairs with minimal interference. This habit of self-rule planted seeds that would matter later, though at the time loyalty to Britain remained strong. Most colonists saw themselves as proud subjects of the empire, even as they created societies distinct from the island across the sea. To walk from Boston to Charleston in the mid-17th century would be to cross not a single country, but a patchwork of cultures. In Boston, the smell of salt air mixed with ink from printing presses and the stern rhythm of Puritan sermons. In Philadelphia, one might hear Quaker meetings in silence, then walk a few blocks to bustling taverns filled with merchants speaking German, Dutch, or English. In Virginia, plantation houses rose along rivers, their wealth built on enslaved labor, while inland cabins echoed with the struggles of farmers and indentured servants. In Charleston, elegant houses stood near slave markets, their streets filled with goods from the Caribbean. Each colony was its own world, its own story, carrying different dreams and contradictions. And yet, when viewed from London, they were all the same: outposts of empire, sources of wealth, pieces of a greater whole. British officials thought of them as colonies to be managed, taxed, and defended. Colonists thought of themselves as communities with their own freedoms and traditions. This difference in perspective would grow into conflict, but in the era of the 13 colonies, it remained an undercurrent rather than an open break. The phrase 13 colonies suggests unity, but in truth, they were 13 experiments, 13 adaptations, 13 societies carved out of forests, plains, and coastlines. They shared common roots but grew in different directions, like branches of a tree spreading toward different skies. Their diversity was their strength, and their divisions were their weakness. They would one day find common cause, but in the 17th and 18th centuries, they remained separate, proud of their differences and uncertain of their future. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of the 13 colonies reminds us that America was never simple. It began as a mosaic, each piece distinct, each world unique, each colony carrying its own burdens and hopes. To understand the United States, one must first understand that it was not born whole, but assembled from these many worlds, stitched together over time, carrying contradictions that still echo today. The 13 colonies were never meant to rebel. For generations, most colonists had seen themselves as loyal subjects of the British Crown, proud to be part of an empire that stretched across the seas. They built towns under English law, raised children under English traditions, and toasted the king in their taverns. But beneath this surface of loyalty, something was shifting. Local assemblies had given colonists a taste of self-rule. Distance from London meant decisions often rested in their own hands. Trade brought wealth, but it also brought frustrations as British officials imposed rules and taxes. By the mid-18th century, these tensions began to spark into flame. The revolution did not arrive overnight. It began with murmurs, protests, and small acts of defiance that slowly grew into a fire no empire could contain. The roots of unrest lay in the debts of empire. Britain's long wars with France, fought across Europe and the Americas, left the crown heavily burdened with debt. The 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in America, had secured vast new territories for Britain, but at staggering cost. To London, it seemed only fair that colonists should help pay for their own defence. To colonists already taxed locally, the new levies felt like an imposition from afar, made without their consent. The famous phrase, "no taxation without representation," was born not from abstract theory, but from daily frustration. The sense that decisions about their lives were being made across an ocean, by men who had never walked their streets. The first sparks flew with laws like the Sugar Act of 1764, which taxed molasses and tightened enforcement of trade restrictions, and the Stamp Act of 1765, which required official stamps on newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. These measures hit ordinary colonists directly, reminding them that Britain could reach into their pockets at will. Protests erupted. Merchants boycotted British goods. Crowds filled the streets, burning effigies of tax collectors. The Sons of Liberty, a group of activists, organized resistance in towns from Boston to New York. The colonies were not yet united, but their shared anger forged new connections. The protests grew louder with each new measure. The Townshend Acts of 1767 taxed imported goods like glass, paper, and tea. Colonists responded with boycotts, refusing to buy British products. Women, often overlooked in the political sphere, played a crucial role, spinning homespun cloth to replace imported textiles and brewing herbal teas instead of imported leaves. These acts of domestic resistance gave the movement depth, bringing the struggle into homes as well as assemblies. The revolution was still years away, but already ordinary people were shaping its course. The British response was to tighten control. Troops were stationed in colonial cities, their red coats a constant reminder of imperial power. In Boston, the presence of soldiers led to simmering tension that finally erupted in 1770, when a crowd clashed with troops and 5 colonists were killed in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Patriots used the incident as propaganda, spreading engravings and pamphlets that depicted the event as a brutal slaughter. For colonists already wary of British authority, it was proof that the Empire's hand could be bloody as well as heavy. The crisis deepened with the Tea Act of 1773. Intended to help the struggling British East India Company, it allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at reduced prices, but with the hated tax still attached. To colonists, it was a trick, an attempt to make them accept taxation disguised as a bargain. In Boston, protest took dramatic form. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, men boarded ships and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the harbour. The Boston Tea Party shocked London and electrified the colonies. It was no longer just about taxes, but about defiance itself. Britain struck back with the Coercive Acts, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston's port until the destroyed tea was paid for, restricted town meetings, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried elsewhere. To enforce order, soldiers were quartered in colonial homes. Far from intimidating the colonies, these acts pushed them closer together. Sympathy for Boston spread through the other colonies, forging a sense of shared fate. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, a remarkable moment in which men from New England, the South, and the Middle colonies sat together to coordinate resistance. The Congress was not yet calling for independence. Most delegates still hoped for reconciliation, seeking to restore their rights as Englishmen rather than break from the crown. But the very act of meeting was revolutionary in itself. It was proof that the colonies could act together, could debate, argue, and compromise as a collective body. In those chambers, the seeds of unity were planted, even as the shadow of war lengthened outside. While leaders debated, tensions on the ground grew hotter. Militias drilled in town squares. Pamphlets spread arguments for liberty. In taverns, men argued about loyalty and rebellion, their voices rising late into the night. The distance between empire and colony grew wider with each passing month. In 1775, the spark finally ignited into flame. British troops marched to seize colonial arms, stored in Concord, Massachusetts. Along the way, they met resistance from colonial militias at Lexington and Concord. Shots were fired, men fell, and the revolution began. What made these sparks so powerful was not only the taxes or the laws, but the sense of identity that had begun to form among colonists. They were no longer just Virginians, Bostonians, or Pennsylvanians. They were beginning to see themselves as something larger, something united by shared struggle. They spoke of liberty, rights, and representation in ways that transcended their local disputes. Out of boycotts, protests, and congresses grew the language of a new people, one that believed it had the right to shape its own destiny. Yet, it is important to remember that not all colonists agreed. Many remained loyal to Britain, seeing rebellion as dangerous and misguided. Others tried to stay neutral, hoping to avoid the costs of conflict. The colonies were divided, their communities fractured by arguments that split families, churches, and towns. Revolution was not inevitable, nor was it universally desired. It was a path chosen by some and resisted by others, a reminder that history is never as simple as it seems in retrospect. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the sparks of America's revolution remind us of something timeless. Change begins not with grand declarations, but with small acts of defiance, with taxes resisted, with boycotts organized, with voices raised in protest. The revolution did not erupt fully formed. It smoldered in streets, in taverns, in assemblies, until it finally caught fire. Those sparks lit not only the path to independence, but the spirit of a nation that would forever see itself as born from resistance, from the courage to say no, and from the belief that a people, however divided, could shape their own destiny. When the first shots cracked across the green at Lexington in April 1775, few could have imagined the scale of what had begun. Farmers and shopkeepers with muskets faced off against professional soldiers of the greatest empire in the world. Smoke curled across fields, shouts echoed, and history pivoted. The American Revolution was no longer a theory discussed in pamphlets or a spark of protest in colonial taverns. It had become a war, and from that war, a republic would be born. Yet the path to independence was anything but certain. The Continental Army was fragile from the beginning. Men signed up for short terms of service, often just months, their loyalty tied to harvest seasons or family needs back home. Supplies were scarce, muskets old, powder limited, shoes wore out in muddy marches, coats were patched with rags, food was often no more than stale bread or salted meat. And yet, under the leadership of George Washington, a Virginian planter chosen to command the army, a sense of determination began to grow. Washington was not perfect, nor always victorious, but he embodied steadiness. His very presence gave men courage, convincing them that this desperate experiment might just survive. The British, for their part, assumed the rebellion would collapse quickly. With fleets dominating the seas and thousands of trained soldiers at their command, they expected the colonies to crumble under the weight of force. Early battles seemed to prove them right. New York fell in 1776, its streets filled with red-coated soldiers. Washington's army retreated across New Jersey, ragged and pursued, morale sinking with every mile. Many believed the revolution would die in those cold weeks, its hopes scattered like leaves in winter winds. But in December of that same year, Washington struck back in a daring move that became legend. Crossing the icy Delaware River at night, his army surprised Hessian mercenaries at Trenton, capturing hundreds and reviving the revolution's spirit. A week later at Princeton, another victory confirmed that the cause was not dead. These moments mattered not because of their scale, but because of their timing. They proved that resilience could outlast despair, that the revolution was not a lost cause, but a living fight. Meanwhile, politics marched alongside war. In Philadelphia, delegates of the Second Continental Congress debated the very meaning of the struggle. By the summer of 1776, the idea of reconciliation with Britain had faded. Voices like Thomas Paine's, in his pamphlet Common Sense, had stirred the people, insisting that independence was not only possible, but necessary. On July 4th, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, proclaiming that all men are created equal, and that governments derive power from the consent of the governed. These words, penned on parchment, gave the revolution a cause larger than survival. They were promises that echoed across generations, even if their fulfillment was uneven and incomplete. The war stretched on, brutal and uncertain. At Saratoga in 1777, American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold achieved a stunning victory, capturing an entire British army. This triumph changed the course of the conflict, convincing France to join the colonists as an ally. French ships, soldiers and money began to flow across the Atlantic, turning a rebellion into an international war. Britain now faced not only ragged colonials, but powerful European rivals, straining its empire across oceans. Yet victories were balanced by suffering. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge tested the Continental Army to its core. Men shivered in drafty huts, frostbitten and hungry, disease spreading through the camp. Many had no shoes, their footprints stained with blood on the snow. Washington's leadership kept them from dissolving, and the arrival of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, brought discipline and training that transformed the army into a more professional force. Out of suffering came strength, and when spring arrived, the army marched with new confidence. The war was not only fought on battlefields. In towns and villages, loyalties divided communities. Loyalists supported Britain, fearing chaos and ruin if the colonies broke away. Patriots pressed for independence, often driving loyalists from their homes. Families were split, neighbours turned against one another, violence simmered in local disputes. For enslaved Africans, the war carried different promises. Some found freedom by escaping to British lines, where they were offered emancipation for service. Others fought for the American cause, hoping liberty might extend to them as well. Indigenous nations faced impossible choices, some allying with Britain, others with the colonists, many simply trying to survive as war engulfed their lands. The revolution was not a simple struggle of colonists against empire, but a conflict that reached deep into every community. The fighting shifted south in the later years, where brutal battles raged across the Carolinas. Guerrilla warfare, ambushes and skirmishes defined the campaigns, as patriot militias harassed British forces. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, used hit-and-run tactics that frustrated larger armies. In 1781, the war reached its climax at Yorktown, Virginia. There, Washington, aided by French forces under Lafayette and French naval power, trapped the British army of General Cornwallis. Surrounded and cut off, Cornwallis surrendered. The news spread like wildfire, igniting celebrations across the colonies. The Revolution's decisive victory had been won. But even after Yorktown, the war dragged on in skirmishes and negotiations until 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, granting it lands stretching to the Mississippi River. A new nation was born, improbable in its survival, fragile in its unity, yet undeniable in its existence. The colonies were no longer colonies. They were states, bound together in a republic unlike any seen before. The Revolution had begun as a struggle over taxes and representation, but it ended as something far larger, a declaration to the world that a people could claim the right to govern themselves. It inspired revolutions abroad, from France to Haiti, and reshaped political thought for centuries. Yet it also carried contradictions. The promises of equality excluded women, enslaved people, and indigenous nations. The new republic was born noble in words, but flawed in practice. a paradox that would shape its history. For Washington, independence meant stepping away from power. He resigned his command rather than seize authority, setting a precedent that leaders served the people rather than ruled them. His humility, rare in an age of kings and emperors, helped solidify the Republic's fragile foundations. The Revolution had produced not only a nation, but a model, imperfect yet enduring, of leadership rooted in restraint. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's birth through revolution reminds us of something timeless. Freedom is not granted but fought for, sustained by sacrifice, carried forward by belief. The revolution was improbable, messy, contradictory, and incomplete, yet it gave rise to an idea that outlived its battles, that a people could chart their own course, even against the greatest of odds. Out of war, hunger, and sacrifice, a republic was born, fragile as a flame, yet strong enough to light the path of history. The war for independence had been won, but victory was not the same as stability. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the United States of America existed only in name and fragile hope. It was a republic born of fire, but its future was uncertain. 13 states, each with its own laws, currencies, and priorities, now faced the challenge of living together as one nation. The experiment of self-government, rare in a world of kings and empires, stood on shaky ground. The first attempt at unity came through the Articles of Confederation, drafted during the war. The Articles created a loose bond between states, a league of friendship rather than a strong government. Each state retained its sovereignty, its independence, and its power to govern itself. The Central Congress could make treaties, declare war, and handle foreign relations, but it could not levy taxes, regulate trade, or enforce its laws. Decisions required the approval of 9 states out of 13, and amending the Articles required unanimity. What had seemed wise in the struggle against British tyranny soon revealed itself as weakness in peace. The problems appeared quickly. The nation had debts from the war owed to soldiers, foreign allies, and domestic lenders, but Congress had no power to raise revenue. It could only beg states for contributions, which often never came. Without funds, the government could not pay its army, leading to unrest among veterans who had sacrificed for independence. Inflation ravaged the economy as states printed their own currencies, each with different values, confusing trade and undermining trust. Tariffs sprang up between states as New York taxed goods from Connecticut and New Jersey, threatening to turn the Union into a patchwork of warring markets. Diplomacy, too, suffered. European powers looked at the new republic with skepticism, doubting its survival. Britain kept troops in forts along the western frontier, refusing to leave despite the peace treaty, arguing that America had not honored its debts to loyalists. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade, crippling Western farmers. Without a strong central government, the United States could not enforce its claims or protect its interests abroad. Independence had brought freedom, but not respect. At home, discontent grew. Farmers in Massachusetts, burdened by taxes and foreclosures, rose in revolt in 1786 under the leadership of Daniel Shays. Shays' rebellion saw armed men marching on courthouses, demanding relief and threatening to topple the state government. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed, it terrified leaders across the young nation. If a few thousand farmers could shake a state, what hope did the Republic have against greater threats? The rebellion revealed that liberty without stability could dissolve into chaos. It was a warning that the experiment was failing. Out of this crisis came the call for reform. In 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia, originally to amend the Articles of Confederation. What emerged was something far bolder: the drafting of a new constitution. In the sweltering heat of summer, behind closed doors, men like George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin debated the future of the nation. They argued over representation, over the balance of power between large states and small, over the role of the executive, over slavery and commerce. Voices clashed, tempers flared, compromises were struck. The result was a document that created a stronger federal government while still balancing state power. It divided authority into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, each designed to check and balance the others. Representation was divided between the House of Representatives, based on population, and the Senate, giving equal voice to each state. The presidency was created to lead, but limited by Congress and courts. The Constitution also allowed for its own amendment, acknowledging that the experiment must be able to adapt. It was not perfect, but it was a framework, a skeleton on which a republic could be built. Ratification was not easy. Fierce debates erupted between Federalists, who supported the new Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, who feared it gave too much power to a central government. Pamphlets, speeches, and newspapers spread arguments across the states. Federalists like Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay wrote essays, later called the Federalist Papers, defending the Constitution as the best means to preserve liberty and order. Anti-Federalists demanded protections for individual rights, fearing tyranny might rise again, this time from within. Their opposition gave birth to one of the Constitution's most enduring features, the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments, added in 1791, guaranteed freedoms of speech, press, and religion, protected the right to bear arms, forbade unreasonable searches, and ensured due process of law. These rights reassured skeptics that the new government would not trample individual liberty. With the Bill of Rights, the Constitution gained broader support, and the fragile experiment took root. The early years of the Republic remained precarious. Washington, elected as the first president in 1789, faced the task of transforming words on parchment into living institutions. He set precedents that defined the presidency, creating a cabinet of advisers, enforcing federal laws, and stepping down after 2 terms to prevent power from becoming monarchy in disguise. His leadership gave credibility to the new government, anchoring it in dignity and restraint. Conflicts still simmered. Political factions emerged almost immediately, dividing into Federalists, led by Hamilton, and Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson. Hamilton sought a strong national bank and closer ties to Britain. Jefferson championed agrarian values and sympathy for France's Revolution. Their disputes marked the beginning of America's political party system, proof that even unity under a new constitution could not erase division. Yet these arguments also showed the Republic's resilience. Disagreement did not destroy it. Instead, it became part of its rhythm. The fragility of the experiment was clear, but so was its promise. The United States had survived war, rebellion, and internal conflict. It had crafted a government that balanced liberty with stability, one that could grow and adapt. The world watched skeptically, expecting collapse, but the Republic endured. It was not yet the nation it would become, but it was no longer merely an idea. It was a government, a system, a people bound together by more than just hope. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's fragile experiment reminds us of something eternal. Freedom alone is not enough. It must be harnessed with structure, protected by law, and tempered by compromise. The Constitution was not a flawless creation, nor was it a guarantee of success. It was instead a gamble, a belief that ordinary people could govern themselves, that power could be checked, and that liberty and order could coexist. The early republic stood on fragile legs, but they held, and in holding, they carried the nation into its next chapter. The young United States was barely a generation old when its people began to look outward, beyond the settled fields and towns that lined the Atlantic coast. Independence had been secured, a constitution had been written, But the Republic's future lay not only in institutions of government, but in the vast spaces waiting beyond the frontier. To live in early America was to feel the pull of horizon, forests stretching west, rivers winding toward unknown lands, prairies that seemed endless, mountains shimmering in distance. Expansion was not only geography, but destiny, a restless energy that defined the nation from its earliest days. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 was the Great Leap. France, under Napoleon, had controlled this enormous territory, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, a land so vast it doubled the size of the United States overnight. For $15 million, Jefferson's administration secured a bargain that stunned the world. To Americans, the purchase promised farmland for generations, rivers for trade, and room to grow. To Jefferson, it was an act of vision, though even he wrestled with whether the Constitution gave him authority to acquire such land. To indigenous nations, it was a silent theft, for their sovereignty was never consulted. Yet the deal set the stage for a century of expansion, embedding the belief that America's future stretched westward. Exploration soon followed. The Lewis and Clark expedition, launched in 1804, carried maps, instruments, and hope into the unknown. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, guided by Sacagawea and supported by a diverse corps of men, traced rivers, crossed mountains, and documented plants, animals, and peoples along the way. Their journey became legend, celebrated in paintings and books, proof that the land could be charted and claimed. Yet behind their triumph lay fragility, moments of near starvation, hostile weather, and the constant need for the goodwill of native communities. The expedition opened doors, but also marked the beginning of greater pressures on the peoples who had lived in those lands for centuries. Frontier life grew quickly. Settlers cut into forests of Kentucky and Ohio, clearing fields for corn and cabins of logs. Flatboats drifted down the Mississippi, carrying goods to New Orleans, linking farmers to markets far from home. Towns rose at river junctions, their streets muddy but alive with trade. The frontier was both opportunity and hardship. Families faced isolation, disease, and the threat of conflict with indigenous nations who resisted encroachment. Yet the promise of land, often cheap or even free through federal policies, pulled families west, generation after generation. For indigenous nations, expansion was disaster. Treaties were signed under pressure, lands ceded, villages uprooted. Some leaders sought accommodation, adopting aspects of European farming or education. Others resisted fiercely, leading warriors against forts and settlers. Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet, dreamed of uniting tribes across the Midwest into a confederation strong enough to resist American expansion. Their vision stirred fear in Washington and inspired indigenous pride, but it was crushed in battles like Tippecanoe and the War of 1812. Again and again, indigenous resistance met with overwhelming force, broken promises, and relentless waves of settlers. The frontier carried contradictions. It promised freedom to poor farmers seeking land, but it also spread slavery westward as plantations grew in new territories. Cotton, made profitable by Eli Whitney's gin, expanded into the Deep South, carrying enslaved people into harsher labor camps across Alabama, Mississippi, and beyond. The same frontier that symbolized liberty for some deepened bondage for others. Expansion widened the divide between North and South, planting seeds of conflict that would erupt later. The push west also shaped American identity. Writers and politicians celebrated the frontier as the forge of democracy, where rugged individuals proved their worth through labor and courage. The image of the self-reliant pioneer became myth, a story told in newspapers, sermons, and speeches. Yet the reality was more complex. Pioneers relied on neighbors, trade, and government land policies. They faced hunger, storms, and isolation that broke many. Women carried heavy burdens, raising families in rough cabins, tending fields, and facing childbirth far from doctors. Children worked beside parents, their lives bound to the rhythm of survival. The frontier was not only freedom, it was toil, struggle, and loss. Trade and infrastructure followed settlers. Roads were cut through forests, canals dug to link rivers and markets. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, opening vast territories to commerce and migration. Towns like Chicago and Cincinnati grew into cities, fueled by the movement of goods and people. Expansion was no longer just drifting west by wagon. It was engineered, planned, and accelerated by government and private enterprise alike. Politics grappled with the consequences. Each new territory raised questions. Would it permit slavery? How would it be governed? Who controlled its land? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 tried to balance free and slave states, a temporary patch on a growing wound. Debates in Congress reflected deeper divides, showing that expansion was not only opportunity, but a source of national tension. Every new horizon carried promise and peril, binding the nation together even as it pulled it apart. Expansion also fueled a sense of destiny. By the 1840s, the phrase "manifest destiny" captured the belief that America was fated to spread across the continent, carrying democracy and progress with it. Newspapers and politicians spoke of it as inevitable, as though divine will had granted the Republic a continent. This belief inspired ambition, but also justified conquest, erasing the rights of indigenous peoples and dismissing the sovereignty of Mexico, which controlled vast lands in the Southwest. Expansion became more than migration. It became ideology, a story Americans told themselves about who they were and where they were going. Yet in the early years, before that phrase was coined, the restless push west was already clear. Families packed wagons, shouldered axes, and followed trails into forests and plains. Soldiers built forts to secure borders. Traders carried goods across rivers. Farmers broke soil into furrows. Each act of settlement was small, but together they transformed the map. The United States was no longer a narrow line of colonies along the Atlantic. It was a nation spreading inland, its people driven by hunger for land, its leaders navigating the costs of growth, its indigenous inhabitants struggling to hold on to their worlds. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's expanding horizons reminds us of something enduring. Nations are not only built in halls of government or on battlefields, they are built on rivers crossed, forests cut, treaties signed and broken, cabins raised, and dreams carried west. Expansion was freedom and tragedy, ambition and loss, vision and violence. It doubled the nation's size, redefined its identity, and set it on a path toward greatness and conflict alike. In the open sky of the frontier lay America's promise and its deepest contradictions. As the United States pushed westward, building towns, cutting canals, and dreaming of destiny, another reality pressed in on the young nation. Beneath the energy of growth, the country was being pulled in two directions. The industrial North and the agrarian South were not simply regions with different crops or cities, they were societies built on different foundations. One placed its hopes in factories, free labor, and commerce. The other relied on plantations, enslaved labor, and a rigid social hierarchy. These differences deepened with every passing decade, turning the Republic into a house divided against itself. Expansion, rather than uniting, revealed and sharpened the fault lines that would eventually shake the nation to its core. In the North, the Industrial Revolution took root. Water-powered mills along New England's rivers turned cotton into cloth. Workshops grew into factories, their machines clattering, their chimneys spilling smoke into the sky. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany arrived in growing numbers, seeking work and bringing cultural diversity to towns and cities. Railroads spread across the landscape, iron tracks stitching together markets, carrying goods faster than ever before. Cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia swelled with commerce, newspapers, and debate. The North was becoming a society defined by movement of people, ideas, and products, its economy built on the energy of industry and trade. The South looked very different. Its wealth came from the soil, from the long rows of cotton, rice, tobacco, and sugarcane that spread across plantations. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had made cotton king, turning it into the most valuable export of the nation. But this wealth rested on the backs of enslaved Africans and their descendants. By the mid-1800s, millions of people lived and labored in bondage across the South, forced to work in fields, houses, and workshops, denied freedom, family stability, and dignity. Their labor made planters rich, created fortunes in land and trade, and fed the mills of the North and Europe. Slavery was not just a Southern institution. It was woven into the economy of the entire nation. The divide was not only economic, but cultural. In the North, a belief in free labor, the idea that individuals could work, save, and rise through merit, became central to identity. Newspapers and politicians praised industriousness, education, and innovation. In the South, honor, hierarchy, and tradition shaped life. Planters saw themselves as a noble class, defenders of a way of life tied to land and family lineage. They argued that slavery was not only necessary but a positive good, claiming it civilized Africans and supported prosperity. These arguments clashed with growing northern critiques that saw slavery as immoral, unjust, and incompatible with the ideals of liberty proclaimed in the Revolution. Religion deepened the divide. The same Bible was read in North and South, but interpretations split. In the North, revival movements inspired abolitionists who preached that slavery was sin. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison demanded immediate emancipation, while former slaves like Frederick Douglass electrified audiences with stories of bondage and freedom. In the South, preachers defended slavery, arguing that Scripture sanctioned the relationship between master and servant. Churches split into northern and southern branches, their unity fractured by the same forces tearing the nation apart. Politics reflected and intensified these conflicts. Each new territory raised the same question: would it permit slavery or not? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a temporary line, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as free, while banning slavery north of latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. But compromise solved little. Every time new land was opened, whether through treaties, purchases, or conquest, the question returned. In Congress, debates grew bitter, with voices rising, fists sometimes flying, and trust eroding. Senators and representatives no longer saw themselves simply as Americans. They saw themselves as Northerners or Southerners first. For enslaved people themselves, the divide was lived reality. Families were torn apart by sales, children separated from parents, husbands from wives. Resistance took many forms. Work slowed, tools broken, songs sung that carried hidden meanings, escapes attempted through swamps and forests. The Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses and allies, helped some reach freedom in the North or Canada, though the journey was dangerous and often fatal. Revolts, like Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, terrified white Southerners, leading to harsher laws and stricter controls. The voices of the enslaved, though suppressed, spoke powerfully through their courage, resilience, and determination to claim humanity. Meanwhile, in the North, abolitionists grew louder, but not all shared their urgency. Many Northerners opposed slavery's expansion without calling for its immediate end, fearing disruption of trade and politics. Racism existed on both sides of the divide, shaping how even freedom was imagined. But the tension was undeniable. Newspapers spread debates, speeches stirred crowds, and every election became a referendum on the question that would not fade. Could a republic dedicated to liberty also be a republic built on slavery? The economy, too, tied the regions together, even as it divided them. Northern factories depended on southern cotton. Southern planters depended on northern banks and shipping. The nation's prosperity was interwoven, but the moral and political contradictions deepened. It was as if two different countries lived under one flag, sharing wealth but not values, bound together but pulling apart. Westward expansion made the contradictions impossible to ignore. Settlers carried both free labor ideals and slavery west into Kansas, Texas, and beyond. Conflicts in these territories turned violent, as in Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in brutal skirmishes. The frontier was no longer only about opportunity, it was a battleground for the soul of the nation. Politicians tried again and again to patch the rift with compromises, but each patch frayed faster than the last. By the 1850s, the divisions had hardened into lines that seemed unbridgeable. The Fugitive Slave Act demanded that Northerners help return escaped slaves, enraging abolitionists. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that African Americans could never be citizens and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories, emboldening the South and enraging the North. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, on a platform opposing slavery's expansion, was the final spark. Southern states, seeing their way of life threatened, chose secession over compromise. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations. But the story of America's divided house reminds us of something enduring. A nation cannot forever carry two opposing truths. Liberty and slavery could not coexist without tearing at the seams. Expansion had promised growth and opportunity, but it also magnified contradictions, forcing the Republic to confront its own soul. The house divided was already trembling, its walls cracking under pressure, and soon the storm of civil war would break upon it, testing whether the fragile experiment of democracy could endure. When the smoke of civil war cleared and the fragile promises of reconstruction faded, America entered a new era, one of steel, steam, and staggering transformation. Between the 1870s and the turn of the 20th century, the United States changed from a nation of farmers and small towns into an industrial giant, a country of railroads, factories, cities, and millionaires whose names still echo today. It was called the Gilded Age, a phrase coined by Mark Twain to suggest a surface glittering with wealth, but covering layers of struggle, poverty, and corruption beneath. To walk through this era was to see breathtaking growth alongside crushing inequality, grit beside gold. Railroads symbolized the age. Steel rails stretched across plains and mountains, linking coasts, carrying goods, people, and ideas with speed never imagined before. Towns grew where the tracks stopped, cities thrived where lines crossed, and fortunes were made by those who controlled the iron arteries of commerce. Cornelius Vanderbilt, once a steamboat magnate, became master of railroads, his name etched into grand stations and sprawling lines. Yet for every tycoon enriched, thousands of laborers sweated and died laying track, blasting tunnels, and braving the wilderness to push trains ever further. The railroad stitched America together, but it was sown with sweat and blood. Industry rose in the East and Midwest. Steel mills in Pittsburgh poured molten metal night and day, feeding the appetite for rails, bridges, and skyscrapers. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant, built an empire on steel, preaching the virtues of efficiency and philanthropy even as his factories demanded grueling labor. Oil gushed in Pennsylvania, fueling lamps, engines, and fortunes for men like John D. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil Company became synonymous with monopoly. Banks and finance, commanded by J.P. Morgan, controlled vast flows of capital, buying companies, stabilizing markets, and concentrating power in unseen hands. These men were called captains of industry by admirers and robber barons by critics, their wealth unrivaled, their influence immense. Cities swelled as immigrants poured in. Millions arrived from Europe, Italians, Poles, Jews, Irish, Germans, Scandinavians, each seeking opportunity, each bringing languages, traditions, and dreams. They crowded into tenements, narrow buildings where families shared cramped rooms, where air was thick with smoke and water was scarce. Sweatshops hummed with sewing machines, children worked long hours, and disease spread quickly. Yet these neighborhoods also pulsed with life. Markets, churches, festivals, newspapers printed in dozens of tongues. The immigrant story was hardship and hope entwined, survival in a new land where opportunity was real, but rarely easy. Laborers began to organize, demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair pay. Strikes and protests shook cities. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 spread like wildfire, workers walking off jobs, trains halted, violence erupting as troops fired on crowds. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886 saw a bomb thrown at police during a labor rally, leading to executions and fear of radicalism. The Pullman Strike of 1894 brought railroads to a standstill, crushed by federal troops. Unions like the Knights of Labor and later the American Federation of Labor grew, giving workers a voice, but their victories were fragile, their efforts often met with bullets and jail cells. The struggle between labor and capital became a defining feature of the Gilded Age, proof that the glitter of wealth was matched by the grit of those who made it possible. Politics mirrored the contradictions. Corruption flourished, with city machines like New York's Tammany Hall trading favors for votes, enriching bosses while draining treasuries. Presidents came and went. Many remembered more for scandals than achievements. The spoils system handed out government jobs to allies, breeding inefficiency. Yet reformers pushed back, demanding civil service exams, regulation of monopolies, and more responsive government. The Interstate Commerce Commission, created in 1887, marked one of the first attempts to regulate big business, though its power was limited. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 sought to curb monopolies, though it was often used against labor unions instead. Democracy in the Gilded Age was vibrant but messy, shaped by money as much as by votes. The West, too, transformed. Miners rushed into mountains for gold, silver, and copper, carving out towns that boomed and busted in rapid succession. Cattle drives stretched across the plains, cowboys guiding herds to railheads, their image later mythologized in song and story. But the frontier was not an empty stage. Native nations, already battered by decades of conflict and displacement, faced final assaults on their sovereignty. Battles like Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors defeated Custer's forces, were followed by crushing defeats. By the 1890s, most indigenous peoples were confined to reservations, their cultures attacked by forced assimilation, their children sent to boarding schools to erase language and tradition. The frontier closed, but not without immense cost to those who had lived there for millennia. Wealth reshaped culture. Mansions rose along Fifth Avenue, glittering with chandeliers and filled with European art. Newport, Rhode Island, became a playground of the rich, where summer cottages sprawled like palaces. The gap between rich and poor widened to staggering proportions, with millionaires living in luxury while immigrants and workers crowded into slums. Writers like Mark Twain, Henry George, and Jacob Riis exposed the contrasts, their words and photographs showing both the splendor and the suffering of the age. The phrase Gilded Age captured it well, a thin layer of gold masking base metal beneath. Yet within this turmoil, the seeds of modern America were sown. Public schools expanded, teaching children of immigrants and workers. Universities grew, funded by industrial fortunes. Inventions changed daily life. The telephone, the electric light, the typewriter. Baseball became the national pastime, theaters thrived, and newspapers carried stories coast to coast. Women, too, began to organize, demanding suffrage and reform. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton carried the fight for the vote, planting movements that would grow in the decades ahead. By the end of the century, America had become something new. It was no longer a fragile republic recovering from war. It was an industrial power, its cities buzzing, its factories roaring, its millionaires shaping markets around the world. Yet it was also a nation of inequality, conflict, and unfinished struggles. Workers demanded justice, immigrants sought belonging. Black Americans in the South endured the rise of Jim Crow laws that stripped away Reconstruction's gains, and native nations mourned the loss of land and sovereignty. The Gilded Age was glitter and shadow, progress and exploitation, invention and injustice, all entwined. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's Gilded Age reminds us of something enduring. Progress is never simple. It comes with contradictions, with triumphs built beside tragedies, with fortunes carved from the toil of many for the wealth of few. The Gilded Age was not only a time of millionaires and machines, it was a crucible in which the struggles of labor, immigration, equality, and democracy took shape. Out of grit and gold, America forged itself anew, a nation both dazzling and divided, its future shimmering on the horizon. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was no longer a fragile republic, unsure of its survival. It was a nation transformed by railroads, factories, immigration, and wealth. Its cities glowed with electric light, its newspapers shouted across continents, its industries fed markets around the world. Yet with this power came new questions. Should America remain focused on its own vast continent, or should it extend its reach beyond its shores? For much of its early history, the United States had been cautious in foreign affairs, wary of entanglements, guided by George Washington's warning to avoid alliances. But by the 1890s, ambition began to outweigh caution. The United States, flush with industrial might and restless energy, stepped onto the world stage. The push outward was partly economic. American factories produced more goods than domestic markets could absorb. Farmers harvested bumper crops that needed buyers abroad. Business leaders and politicians alike argued that overseas markets were essential for prosperity. Expansion was also cultural, fueled by a belief in destiny that extended beyond the continent. The same spirit that had driven pioneers west now turned toward islands and oceans, framed by ideas of spreading democracy, Christianity, and civilization. Imperialism, already practiced by European empires across Africa and Asia, became a temptation America could not resist. Hawaii was one of the first steps. American missionaries and planters had lived on the islands for decades, building sugar plantations that tied Hawaii's economy to the United States. By the 1890s, American businessmen dominated politics there, and when Queen Liliuokalani sought to restore Hawaiian sovereignty, she was overthrown with U.S. support. In 1898, Hawaii was annexed, becoming both a prize and a stepping stone across the Pacific. It marked a turning point, the quiet shift from continental power to oceanic empire. The defining moment, however, came with the Spanish-American War in 1898. Tensions with Spain had been growing over its colonies in Cuba and the Philippines. American newspapers, eager for circulation, exaggerated Spanish atrocities in Cuba, stirring public outrage with sensational headlines. When the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing more than 250 sailors, cries of "Remember the Maine" filled the streets. Whether the explosion was caused by Spanish attack or accident hardly mattered. The nation was swept into war. The conflict lasted only a few months, but had enormous consequences. American forces quickly defeated Spanish troops in Cuba, aided by Cuban revolutionaries who had long fought for independence. In the Philippines, Admiral George Dewey's fleet destroyed Spanish ships in Manila Bay, stunning the world with the swiftness of victory. American troops captured Guam, Puerto Rico, and other territories. By the Treaty of Paris, Spain ceded its last major colonies to the United States, marking the end of one empire and the rise of another. The war was hailed as a triumph, but it raised difficult questions. Cuba was granted nominal independence, though the United States retained the right to intervene in its affairs, establishing a pattern of influence that would shape the Caribbean for decades. Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory, its people American citizens without full representation. Guam became a naval base, projecting power into the Pacific. The Philippines, however, sparked fierce debate. Many Americans saw annexation as a betrayal of the nation's founding ideals, arguing that a republic born in revolt against empire had no right to rule another people without their consent. Yet others saw opportunity in controlling the Philippines, both strategically and economically. Filipino revolutionaries who had fought against Spain resisted U.S. occupation. The Philippine-American War that followed was brutal, lasting from 1899 to 1902, with guerrilla warfare, massacres, and heavy casualties. American soldiers, many fresh from defeating Spain, now found themselves fighting a determined independence movement, using tactics that shocked a nation still telling itself it fought for freedom. The war left scars in the Philippines and cast shadows on America's self-image, showing that empire carried costs not only in treasure but in conscience. At the same time, America flexed its new influence in other arenas. The open-door policy in China, promoted by Secretary of State John Hay, sought equal access to Chinese markets, reflecting America's growing role in global trade. The construction of the Panama Canal, though completed later, was envisioned during this era as a way to link oceans, speed commerce, and cement America's place in international affairs. Theodore Roosevelt, who emerged as a national hero during the war, embodied the new spirit. His big stick diplomacy emphasized strength, readiness, and willingness to intervene when necessary, whether in Latin America or across the seas. The turn of the century was also a moment of pride. America's victory over Spain announced its arrival as a world power, joining Britain, France, and Germany at the table of empire. Naval parades, flag raisings, and world fairs celebrated the nation's energy and ambition. The imagery of the time showed America as a rising giant, young and vigorous, carrying light into the world. Yet, beneath the celebrations were debates that cut deep. Was this expansion true to the Republic's ideals, or was it a betrayal? Could a nation founded on liberty justify ruling others without their consent? These questions echoed in Congress, in newspapers, and in the minds of citizens. At home, the effects of expansion mingled with domestic struggles. Soldiers returned from overseas to cities grappling with labor strikes, poverty, and racial violence. Black soldiers who had fought bravely in Cuba and the Philippines returned to discrimination, their service unrecognized in a society still bound by segregation. Immigrant workers fueled the economy but faced suspicion and hostility. The promise of liberty abroad contrasted painfully with the reality of inequality at home. And yet, America's role in the world could not be reversed. Once it had seized territories, once it had fought battles across oceans, once it had raised its flag over foreign lands, it had stepped into a new era. The Republic of Washington and Jefferson, once cautious of entanglements, had become an empire in its own right, a player on the world stage. This transformation reshaped not only foreign policy, but national identity. Americans began to see themselves not just as citizens of a republic, but as leaders of a global power, with all the pride, responsibility, and contradictions that entailed. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's arrival on the world stage reminds us of something deeper. Nations grow not only by building within, but by reaching beyond, and in doing so, they confront the tension between ideals and ambitions. The United States of the late 19th century glittered with power and confidence, but behind that glitter lay hard questions of morality, democracy, and justice. To step onto the world stage was to embrace greatness and to invite the burdens that greatness always brings. The dawn of the 20th century found the United States transformed. It was no longer a fragile republic, no longer just a young nation on the periphery of global affairs. It was a rising power, confident, restless, and increasingly entangled with the wider world. Its railroads stretched across continents, its factories poured out steel, cars, and textiles, its wealth soared. Yet its journey into the century would be defined not only by prosperity, but by fire and steel, by wars that shook the globe, by collapses that humbled millions, and by the relentless push and pull between promise and peril. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, America at first stood apart. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality, urging the nation to remain impartial in thought as well as in action. Many Americans agreed. The war seemed distant, fought in muddy trenches far across the Atlantic. Immigrants with roots in Europe had divided loyalties, and few wanted to see their sons die in foreign battles. Yet neutrality proved impossible. American ships crossed oceans carrying goods, feeding both sides of the conflict. But Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare threatened lives and commerce alike. When the Lusitania was torpedoed in 1915, killing more than 100 Americans, outrage grew. Still, Wilson hesitated. He campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But by 1917, circumstances changed. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine attacks. The infamous Zimmermann telegram revealed German plans to encourage Mexico to attack the United States. The illusion of neutrality collapsed. In April 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, framing it as a struggle to make the world safe for democracy. America, reluctant at first, entered the Great War. The war transformed the nation. Millions of young men were drafted, sent to training camps, then across the Atlantic. Factories retooled for weapons, ships, and uniforms. Women entered workplaces in greater numbers, filling roles once reserved for men. African Americans moved north in the Great Migration, seeking jobs in booming industrial cities, reshaping demographics and culture. Propaganda posters filled streets, urging citizens to conserve food, buy war bonds, and trust the cause. The United States, once hesitant, mobilized with astonishing speed. On the battlefields of France, American troops, the doughboys, arrived fresh, their presence tipping the balance in favor of the exhausted Allies. In battles like Belleau Wood and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, American soldiers fought fiercely, suffering heavy losses but proving decisive. When the armistice came on November 11, 1918, America had helped end the war, and its role as a global power was undeniable. Yet the victory was bittersweet. More than 100,000 Americans had died, and millions worldwide had perished. The war left scars not only on fields of Europe, but on the psyche of an entire generation. Wilson sought to shape the peace. He proposed his 14 points, envisioning a world of self-determination, open diplomacy, and collective security through a League of Nations. But at home, politics fractured. The Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, wary of entangling alliances. America, triumphant yet divided, retreated into isolation once more. The nation had stepped onto the world stage, but hesitated to remain there. The 1920s seemed at first a time of relief, even celebration. The war was over, the economy surged, and a sense of modernity swept through daily life. Automobiles, pioneered by Henry Ford's assembly lines, put millions on the road. Radios carried music and news into homes, shrinking distances and spreading culture. Jazz roared in clubs, symbolizing both innovation and rebellion. Women gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920, their voices reshaping politics. Flappers challenged traditional roles with short skirts, bobbed hair, and bold attitudes. Cities glittered with skyscrapers, while consumer goods, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, cosmetics reshaped households. The Roaring Twenties was not just a phrase, it was a sensation, a belief that the future had arrived. Yet beneath the glamour lay unease. Prohibition, enacted by the 18th Amendment, banned alcohol but unleashed speakeasies, bootleggers, and organized crime. Figures like Al Capone became infamous, their empires built on illegal liquor. Racial tensions flared, with Ku Klux Klan membership rising and race riots erupting in cities. Immigration quotas limited arrivals from Europe, reflecting fears of cultural change. Farmers, who had prospered during the war, now faced falling prices and debt. The glitter of the Jazz Age often masked deep divides. The stock market became the symbol of prosperity. Investors poured money into shares, convinced that prices would rise forever. Banks lent freely, and ordinary Americans bought stocks on margin, borrowing to invest. For a time, the gamble worked. Wealth seemed to grow endlessly, feeding a belief in unstoppable progress. But in October 1929, the illusion collapsed. The stock market crashed, wiping out fortunes in days. Panic spread, banks failed, businesses closed. What began as a financial collapse cascaded into the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history. The Depression reshaped every life. Families lost homes, jobs, and savings. Breadlines stretched through cities, men and women waiting for food to survive. Farmers watched crops rot while they could not afford to harvest them. Dust storms swept across the plains, stripping soil and driving families westward in desperate search of work. Children left school to help families. Older men wandered in search of odd jobs. Once prosperous workers stood in soup kitchens with empty bowls. The myth of endless American prosperity was broken. The government struggled to respond. At first, President Herbert Hoover insisted recovery was near, urging voluntary charity rather than federal action. His efforts seemed distant, inadequate, and he became a symbol of helplessness. Shantytowns of the homeless were mockingly called Hoovervilles. By 1932, despair had deepened into anger, and the nation turned to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose New Deal promised bold action. Roosevelt's leadership offered not only policies, but hope. His fireside chats crackled over radios, speaking directly to families huddled in kitchens and parlors. He launched programs to put people to work, building roads, bridges, parks, and schools. Agencies stabilized banks, insured deposits, and supported farmers. Social Security laid the foundation for old age pensions and welfare. The New Deal did not end the Depression, but it gave people faith that government was not helpless. It redefined the role of the state in American life, embedding an expectation that the federal government bore responsibility for the well-being of its citizens. Through fire and steel, prosperity and collapse, the early 20th century tested the nation in ways no one could have predicted in 1900. America had fought in global war, reveled in roaring prosperity, and endured crushing depression. It had seen skyscrapers rise and dust storms choke the land, fortunes made and lives broken. It had stepped onto the world stage, then hesitated, then been forced to face the responsibilities of power again and again. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations. But the story of America's fire and steel in the 20th century reminds us of something enduring. A nation's character is revealed not only in its triumphs, but in its trials. Prosperity dazzles, but hardship teaches. The United States entered the century with confidence, was humbled by depression, yet emerged with resilience. Out of war, jazz, crash, and dust, America carried forward a restless energy, one that would soon be tested again, in a global conflict greater than any it had yet seen. When the echoes of the First World War faded, Americans told themselves it had been the war to end all wars. The sacrifice of millions, The devastation across Europe, the promises of peace, all of it seemed too costly to repeat. The United States retreated into isolation, wary of entangling alliances, focused instead on recovering from depression and rebuilding at home. But history rarely honors such wishes. By the late 1930s, new storms gathered overseas. Dictators in Germany, Italy, and Japan rose, preaching expansion, conquest, and empire. The world slid once more toward catastrophe, and despite its reluctance, the United States would again be drawn into the conflict. This time, when the smoke cleared, America would emerge not simply as a participant, but as one of the two most powerful nations on Earth. The seeds of the conflict were sown in Europe. Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, promising to restore national pride after the humiliation of World War I. His regime built armies, crushed dissent, and spread hatred, targeting Jews and other minorities in campaigns that would grow into the Holocaust. Italy under Mussolini pursued empire in Africa. Japan expanded across Asia, seizing Manchuria and invading China. Democracies hesitated, haunted by memories of the last war, hoping appeasement might contain aggression. But aggression fed on hesitation, and soon the world was burning. When war erupted in Europe in 1939, the United States declared neutrality. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, aware of the danger, balanced caution with preparation. He expanded the military, provided aid to Britain through the Lend-Lease program, and urged Americans to see the conflict as tied to their own security. Still, public opinion clung to isolation. Many believed the oceans would protect them, that Europe's quarrels could remain Europe's burden. That illusion ended abruptly on December 7, 1941, when Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned, sailors perished, and the Pacific Fleet lay crippled. Roosevelt's words the next day, a date which will live in infamy, galvanized the nation. Congress declared war, and America was thrust into global conflict once more. Mobilization was immediate and immense. Factories shifted overnight from cars to tanks, from typewriters to rifles, from refrigerators to bombers. Millions of men enlisted or were drafted, while millions of women filled factories, offices, and shipyards. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter captured their spirit, sleeves rolled, rivet gun in hand, proving that patriotism could be wielded with a wrench as well as a rifle. Rationing shaped daily life. Sugar, gasoline, and meat were limited, while victory gardens sprouted in backyards. Propaganda urged unity, vigilance, and sacrifice. The nation that had seemed fractured by depression just years before now moved in lockstep toward victory. The war was fought on two vast fronts. In the Pacific, the United States faced a determined Japanese empire. Battles at Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were fought with ferocity, island by island, in jungles and across oceans, at staggering cost. The brutality of combat, the kamikaze attacks, and the sheer distances involved tested American endurance. Yet, step by step, the Pacific tide turned, US forces advancing ever closer to Japan itself. In Europe, American troops joined British, Soviet, and other Allied forces in confronting Nazi Germany. The invasion of North Africa in 1942, the campaigns in Italy, and finally the Great Invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day, marked the turning points. Thousands of soldiers stormed beaches under withering fire, forging a foothold that led to liberation of France and the eventual march into Germany. The horrors of the Holocaust were uncovered as Allied troops liberated concentration camps, revealing the depths of Nazi crimes. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and the map of Europe was forever altered. The Pacific War, however, continued. The planned invasion of Japan loomed, expected to cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Instead, the United States unleashed a new weapon, one born of secret laboratories and unimaginable science: the atomic bomb. In August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck, cities reduced to ashes, tens of thousands killed instantly, many more scarred by radiation. Japan surrendered days later. The world had entered the nuclear age, and the United States held a weapon unlike any seen before. Victory was complete, but the shadow of atomic fire haunted triumph. At home, the war brought both progress and injustice. Women had proven their ability in workplaces, yet many were pushed back into domestic roles when soldiers returned. African Americans served bravely in segregated units like the Tuskegee Airmen, but faced discrimination at home. The contradiction was glaring. A war fought for freedom abroad was fought by people denied it at home. The Double V campaign, Victory Against Fascism Abroad and Racism at Home, captured the struggle. Japanese Americans suffered internment, their families uprooted, homes lost, liberty denied in the name of security. For many, the war years were both proud and painful. Victories mingled with betrayals. When peace came, the world was transformed. Europe lay shattered, its empires weakened, its cities broken. The Soviet Union emerged as a giant, its armies having borne immense sacrifice. The United States, untouched by bombing and bolstered by its industrial surge, stood stronger than ever. Its economy thrived, its military unmatched, its influence global. No longer could America retreat into isolation. The oceans had not kept it safe. Engagement had been inevitable. Now engagement became responsibility. The United Nations was created in 1945, with America playing a leading role. The Marshall Plan poured aid into Europe, rebuilding economies, preventing collapse, and fostering alliances. NATO, formed in 1949, tied the United States to Western Europe in mutual defense. The Cold War, soon to dominate decades, had begun. The United States was not only a republic across a continent, it was a superpower shaping the fate of the world. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's Second World War reminds us of something enduring. Freedom is never secure without sacrifice, and victory carries burdens as well as pride. The United States fought across oceans, toppled tyrannies, and emerged stronger than ever. But in doing so, it inherited new responsibilities, new dangers, and a world remade by fire. The republic that had once been fragile now stood mighty, its flag raised not only over its own soil, but across oceans, its destiny tied to the fate of humanity itself. When the guns of World War II fell silent, Americans hoped peace had finally arrived. Soldiers returned home to parades, factories shifted from tanks back to cars, and families imagined futures of prosperity. Yet almost immediately, a new conflict emerged. Not a war fought with rifles and trenches, but a long, tense standoff fought with ideology, espionage, and the ever-present threat of annihilation. The Cold War, as it came to be known, would shape the second half of the 20th century. It cast shadows over every decision, every invention, every dream. For nearly 50 years, the United States and the Soviet Union confronted each other in a twilight struggle that defined the modern world. At its heart, the Cold War was about ideas. The United States stood for liberal democracy and capitalism, promising freedom, elections, and opportunity. The Soviet Union stood for communism, promising equality through state control of industry and society. Each side believed its system was not only better, but destined to prevail. The clash was not just about borders or armies. It was about the soul of the world. Who would win the loyalty of nations emerging from colonial rule? Who would shape the future of technology, culture, and human rights? The rivalry took shape immediately after the war. Europe was divided into zones of occupation, and soon the continent hardened into two blocks. In the West, the Marshall Plan poured American money into rebuilding, ensuring stability and tying economies to US markets. In the East, the Soviet Union tightened control over Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other nations, creating communist governments loyal to Moscow. Winston Churchill captured the divide in 1946 when he declared that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. Germany itself was split, Berlin divided, its future a symbol of the larger conflict. Nuclear weapons made the Cold War unlike any struggle before. The United States had ended World War II with the atomic bomb, but by 1949 the Soviets had their own. Suddenly, humanity lived with the knowledge that entire cities could vanish in seconds. The doctrine of deterrence emerged. Each side built more and more weapons, not to use them, but to prevent the other from striking first. This balance of terror came to be known as mutually assured destruction. The world lived in fear of sirens, mushroom clouds, and the possibility that one miscalculation could end civilization. The Cold War was global. In Asia, the Korean War erupted in 1950 when North Korean forces, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, invaded the South. The United States, under the flag of the United Nations, fought to repel the invasion. The conflict ended in stalemate, the peninsula divided, but it proved that the Cold War would be fought not only in Europe, but wherever communism and capitalism collided. Later, in Vietnam, the struggle became even bloodier, drawing America into a long, costly war that divided its own people. Proxy wars, coups, and revolutions across Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East all became arenas where the two superpowers sought advantage. At home, the Cold War fueled fear and suspicion. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed communist spies had infiltrated government, the military, and Hollywood. Investigations, blacklists, and accusations destroyed careers and lives. Ordinary citizens were urged to be vigilant, to report suspicious behavior, to trust no one fully. Civil defense drills taught school children to crouch under desks in case of nuclear attack, a ritual that offered little real protection but imprinted dread into daily life. The Cold War was not only fought overseas, it lived in the minds of Americans. Yet it was also an age of extraordinary innovation. The space race began when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the first satellite to orbit Earth. Americans were shocked, fearful of Soviet dominance in space and missiles. The United States responded with NASA, pouring resources into science and engineering. The race culminated in 1969 when Apollo 11 carried Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon. Their footsteps in lunar dust were more than scientific achievement, they were symbols of American determination to lead. Technology advanced at a pace unmatched in history. From jet travel to computers, much of it fueled by Cold War competition. Culture reflected the tension. Hollywood produced films about nuclear war and espionage. Novels imagined dystopian futures or worlds of constant surveillance. Music and art sometimes served as protest, sometimes as propaganda. The struggle seeped into everything, shaping education, science, and even family life. To grow up in America during the Cold War was to feel both pride in national strength and fear of sudden destruction. Moments of crisis brought the world to the brink. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted when US intelligence discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba. For 13 days, the world watched as President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev faced off. US ships blockaded Cuba, nuclear forces were placed on alert, and the possibility of war loomed. At the last moment, diplomacy prevailed. The Soviets withdrew missiles from Cuba, and the US secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended, but it showed how close humanity had come to disaster. Despite hostility, there were also efforts at détente, periods of easing tension. Treaties limited nuclear weapons, exchanges of culture and science built small bridges, and leaders met to manage rivalry. But the competition never fully ended. When one side gained advantage, the other pushed back. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 reignited hostility, and the United States responded by supporting Afghan resistance fighters. The arms race surged again, with new missiles and defense systems raising the stakes. By the 1980s, the Cold War had lasted for decades, shaping entire generations. Yet change was coming. The Soviet Union faced economic stagnation, political unrest, and the strain of trying to match American spending. New leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, in hopes of saving the system. Instead, they unleashed forces that led to collapse. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, the symbol of division, was breached as East Germans crossed freely to the West. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, ending the Cold War. The United States stood as the sole superpower, its long twilight struggle finally over. The Cold War shadows stretched across nearly every corner of modern life. It brought fear, but also progress, suspicion, but also solidarity. It reshaped alliances, technology, culture, and the very imagination of humanity. For nearly half a century, Americans lived in its grip, waking each day in a world where peace was fragile and destruction possible. Its end was celebrated, but its legacy endured, in nuclear arsenals that remained, in regions scarred by proxy wars, in memories of drills and dread, in triumphs of space and science. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's Cold War reminds us of something enduring. Great struggles are not always fought on battlefields. Some are fought in silence, in shadows, in the realm of fear and possibility. The United States emerged from this twilight not only stronger, but transformed, its destiny forever tied to the balance of power, its role no longer regional, but global. The Cold War was a contest of survival and vision, and in its ending lay both relief and responsibility. While the Cold War stretched its shadow across oceans and continents, another struggle unfolded within the United States itself. It was not a battle with bombs or missiles, but with voices, marches, and laws. The mid-20th century was an age of social revolutions, when long-denied rights were demanded, when traditions were challenged, and when the promise of American liberty was tested on its own streets. Civil rights, women's liberation, youth rebellion, and new cultural movements surged together, reshaping the fabric of the nation in ways as profound as any war or election. At the heart of this upheaval was the civil rights movement. For nearly a century after the end of slavery, African Americans had lived under a system of segregation and discrimination, especially in the South. Jim Crow laws enforced separate schools, restaurants, buses, and neighborhoods. Voter suppression was routine, with literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation blocking access to democracy. Violence, from lynchings to police brutality, reinforced inequality. The contradiction was stark. A nation proclaiming freedom abroad denied it to millions at home. By the 1950s, cracks appeared in the old order. In 1954, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. The ruling was a legal thunderclap, striking at the doctrine of separate but equal. Yet enforcement was slow and bitterly resisted. In 1957, when 9 black students attempted to enter Little Rock Central High School, they were met by mobs and the Arkansas National Guard. President Eisenhower intervened with federal troops, escorting the students through angry crowds. The images shocked the world, showing the lengths to which some would go to defend segregation. Activism grew. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, sparking a year-long boycott led by a young minister named Martin Luther King, Jr. His message of nonviolent resistance, rooted in faith and moral conviction, inspired thousands. Marches, sit-ins, and freedom rides followed, challenging segregation at lunch counters, bus terminals, and universities. Protesters faced arrests, beatings, and fire hoses, but their courage drew national attention. Television, a relatively new medium, carried images of peaceful marchers attacked by police dogs, stirring outrage across the country and abroad. The federal government, under pressure, began to act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public accommodations and employment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck down barriers to the ballot, empowering African Americans to participate fully in democracy. These victories were monumental, reshaping the legal landscape. Yet the struggle was far from over. Economic inequality, housing discrimination, and systemic racism persisted. Cities erupted in riots, frustration boiling over into flames. Leaders like King pressed for broader justice, calling for an end to poverty and war as well as racism. His assassination in 1968 was a devastating blow, leaving the movement shaken but not silenced. Alongside civil rights, other movements rose. Women, long confined by social expectations, demanded equality in the workplace, in education, and in politics. The publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 challenged the notion that fulfillment could only be found in domestic roles. The National Organization for Women formed, pushing for legislation, reproductive rights, and an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. Women marched, organized, and spoke out, reshaping public discourse. Though resistance was strong, progress came in the form of greater access to careers, sports, and representation. Youth played a central role in this era of revolution. College campuses became centers of protest against racial injustice, restrictions on free speech, and eventually the Vietnam War. The counterculture rejected traditional values, embracing new forms of music, fashion, and lifestyles. Rock and roll festivals like Woodstock symbolized a generation seeking freedom in expression and community. Drug experimentation, spiritual exploration, and defiance of authority became hallmarks of the era. For many, it was liberation. For others, chaos. But the energy of youth ensured that questions once whispered were shouted in public squares. Latino and Native American activists also raised their voices. The Chicano movement sought educational reform, labor rights for farm workers, and cultural pride. Leaders like Cesar Chavez organized strikes and boycotts, demanding fair treatment for agricultural laborers. Native American groups staged occupations, such as at Alcatraz and Wounded Knee, calling attention to broken treaties, poverty, and sovereignty. Their demands reminded the nation that justice was not limited to black and white, but extended to all marginalized peoples. Gay and lesbian Americans, long forced into secrecy, also began to fight openly for recognition. The Stonewall Uprising in 1969, sparked by a police raid on a New York City bar, marked a turning point. Pride marches followed, building a movement that demanded equality, dignity, and visibility. What had once been hidden began to claim space in public life, challenging long-standing prejudices. Even within mainstream politics, reforms reflected the age of change. Medicare and Medicaid expanded healthcare access. Environmental movements grew after the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, highlighting pollution and conservation. Earth Day was first celebrated in 1970, symbolizing a new awareness of humanity's impact on the planet. The Supreme Court issued landmark decisions on privacy, criminal rights, and equality. Institutions once thought unchanging bent under the pressure of activism and shifting values. Yet with progress came backlash. Many Americans felt disoriented by the rapid changes, clinging to traditions they saw slipping away. The rise of conservative movements reflected a desire to restore order, stability, and traditional morality. Politicians capitalized on fears of crime, protest, and cultural upheaval. The struggle between reform and resistance became a central theme of late 20th century politics, shaping debates for decades. The social revolutions of this period did not solve every injustice, but they redefined what America could be. They expanded the circle of rights, gave voice to the silenced, and forced the nation to confront contradictions between its ideals and its realities. They also showed that change was not granted from above, but demanded from below, won through persistence, courage, and sacrifice. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America's civil rights and social revolutions reminds us of something enduring. A nation is not fixed. It is alive, reshaped by those who dare to push against limits. The marches, sit-ins, speeches, and protests of the mid-20th century were not only about changing laws, they were about expanding imagination, redefining what freedom meant, and ensuring that liberty was not a promise for the few, but a right for all. The Cold War ended with a crumbling wall in Berlin and a dissolving Soviet Union, leaving the United States standing alone as the world's sole superpower. The sense of triumph was palpable. The 1990s opened with optimism. Democracy seemed ascendant, technology was racing forward, and America's influence stretched into every corner of the globe. Yet history does not pause, and the turn of the millennium would bring both dazzling progress and sobering crises. From the boom of the digital age to the shock of terrorist attacks, from wars in distant deserts to the collapse of Wall Street, the story of America at the dawn of the 21st century was one of soaring highs and shattering lows. The 1990s glittered with prosperity. The economy surged, fueled by globalization, deregulation, and especially the explosion of the Internet. Silicon Valley transformed from orchards into the nerve center of a digital revolution. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, and later Amazon and Google redefined business, communication, and culture. Personal computers became household staples, email replaced letters, and a generation grew up learning to navigate cyberspace. Stock markets soared, retirement accounts swelled, and the phrase .com became synonymous with wealth. For many, it seemed the promise of endless growth had returned. Culturally, the 1990s were defined by both confidence and anxiety. American music, film, and television dominated the globe, exporting images of prosperity and freedom. Globalization carried jeans, fast food, and Hollywood blockbusters into far-flung cities. Yet beneath the glitter, there were tremors: the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, the Columbine school shooting in 1999, rising debates over culture wars, and anxieties about what the year 2000 might bring. The Y2K computer bug, feared to crash systems worldwide, proved anticlimactic. But it revealed how dependent America had become on the digital networks it had created. The attacks of September 11, 2001, changed everything. On a clear morning, hijacked planes struck the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, while another crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost, and the nation was stunned. The images of towers collapsing, of ash-covered streets, of first responders rushing into danger seared themselves into memory. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America felt directly attacked at home, its sense of invulnerability shattered. The response was swift. President George W. Bush declared a war on terror, vowing to dismantle networks like Al-Qaeda, who had planned the attacks, and to target states that harbored them. The United States invaded Afghanistan in late 2001, toppling the Taliban regime that sheltered Osama bin Laden. At first, the war seemed successful, but insurgency and instability soon set in, dragging the conflict into the longest war in American history. In 2003, attention turned to Iraq. Citing fears of weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorism, the Bush administration launched an invasion. Baghdad fell quickly, Saddam Hussein was captured, but weapons stockpiles were never found. What followed was years of insurgency, sectarian violence, and costly occupation. The Iraq War, controversial from the start, divided Americans and strained alliances abroad. At home, September 11th reshaped daily life. Airports filled with new layers of security. Surveillance expanded through the Patriot Act, raising debates over liberty and safety. Soldiers deployed by the hundreds of thousands, and their families bore the burdens of repeated tours. Veterans returned with visible wounds and hidden traumas. Meanwhile, suspicion and prejudice targeted Muslim Americans, many facing discrimination and fear. The war on terror, fought abroad, also reshaped the nation within. Yet, even amid conflict, the 2000s were marked by technological transformation. Social media platforms emerged, changing how people connected, how news spread, and how communities formed. Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter turned individuals into publishers, creating new spaces for expression, but also new avenues for misinformation. Smartphones placed the internet in every pocket, altering commerce, communication, and even relationships. The digital revolution promised empowerment, but also brought dislocation, as jobs shifted and privacy eroded. The mid-2000s brought another kind of shock, economic rather than military. Housing markets, inflated by speculation and risky lending, began to collapse. Banks had bundled bad loans into complex securities, spreading risk throughout the financial system. When the bubble burst in 2008, the results were catastrophic. Lehman Brothers fell, credit froze, stock markets plummeted. Millions of Americans lost homes, jobs, and savings. The Great Recession, as it came to be called, was the deepest economic crisis since the 1930s. Families lined up at food banks, unemployment soared, and anger at Wall Street boiled. Government bailouts stabilized the system but fueled resentment, as ordinary people felt abandoned while corporations were rescued. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 symbolized both change and contradiction. As the first African-American president, his victory represented a milestone in the long struggle for civil rights. His message of hope and unity resonated in a moment of despair. Yet his presidency also unfolded against fierce polarization, with bitter battles over healthcare, the stimulus, and America's role in the world. The optimism of his election revealed the nation's capacity for progress, but the resistance it provoked underscored divisions that would only deepen. From millennium to meltdown, the story of America in these years was one of ambition and vulnerability. The nation that had entered the century as unchallenged superpower found itself humbled by terrorism, entangled in wars without clear victory, and shaken by financial collapse. Yet it also innovated, adapted, and sought renewal. Its culture remained influential, its economy resilient, its people determined. The highs were dazzling, the lows devastating, but together they captured the complexity of a nation stepping into a new century with both confidence and uncertainty. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America at the turn of the millennium reminds us of something enduring. Power alone does not guarantee safety. Prosperity alone does not ensure justice. The 21st century opened with triumph and tragedy entwined, with America tested in ways its leaders could not predict. The Republic endured, scarred but standing, facing a future in which old struggles and new challenges would continue to define its course. History never really ends. It shifts, it bends, it carries its echoes forward. The story of the United States is not a tale with a neat conclusion, but a living current, restless and unfinished. From revolution to republic, from civil war to civil rights, from prosperity to depression, from isolation to superpower, the nation has always moved between triumph and trial. The 21st century continues that rhythm. The challenges may look different than muskets at Lexington or tanks in Normandy, but they are woven from the same threads: liberty, conflict, identity, and the struggle to balance ideals with reality. In the years after the Great Recession, America sought recovery. The economy slowly stabilized, yet inequality widened. Cities flourished with technology and finance, while rural areas struggled with factory closures, declining industries, and shrinking populations. This divide deepened political tensions, reshaping elections and discourse. Social media, once celebrated as a tool of connection, amplified division, spreading both community and conspiracy. Voices, once confined to corners, now reached millions instantly, sometimes enlightening, sometimes distorting. The digital revolution, like every American transformation, carried both promise and peril. Terrorism remained a shadow, though different from the shock of September 11th. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dragged on, costing lives and treasure, with unclear victories. Veterans returned home, carrying burdens that would last lifetimes. The debate over America's role in the world sharpened. Should the nation continue to act as global policeman, or should it turn inward? Allies questioned American reliability, rivals tested its resolve, and citizens themselves wrestled with fatigue over endless conflict. The superpower of the 20th century faced a new century of uncertainty. Social struggles, too, surged forward. The civil rights movement of the 1960s had toppled legal segregation, but racial inequality remained. Protests over police violence, voting rights, and systemic discrimination became defining moments of the 2000s, 10s, and beyond. The phrase "Black Lives Matter" echoed in streets across cities, demanding accountability and change. Like earlier generations, activists used marches, speeches, and, now, viral videos to force the nation to confront its contradictions. Progress was undeniable, but so was resistance, the rhythm of reform and backlash as old as the Republic itself. Other revolutions reshaped culture. Marriage equality, once unthinkable, became law in 2015, expanding rights and recognition for LGBTQ Americans. Immigration remained both a source of strength and of fierce debate, with policies shifting between welcome and restriction. Women's voices grew louder in movements against harassment and inequality, echoing the struggles of suffragists and feminists before them. Each generation tested the boundaries of American ideals, demanding they stretch wider, fairer, truer. Crisis came again in 2020, not from foreign armies but from disease. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world, claiming lives, overwhelming hospitals, and halting economies. Streets emptied, businesses shuttered, families grieved. Masks and vaccines became symbols not only of public health, but of political and cultural divides. The pandemic revealed strengths in resilience and innovation. Vaccines developed with unprecedented speed, but also exposed fractures in trust, governance, and solidarity. The toll was heavy, and its echoes continue. Through all of this, democracy itself became a subject of anxiety. Polarization deepened, elections grew contested, and confidence in institutions wavered. The Capitol was stormed in January 2021, shocking a nation that prided itself on peaceful transitions of power. The imagery, flags waving in broken windows, lawmakers fleeing chambers, reminded Americans that democracy is never guaranteed. It must be tended, defended, renewed. The questions facing the Republic were the same ones asked at its birth. Who are the people? How do liberty and equality coexist? What is the balance between unity and dissent? And yet, for all the turbulence, the story endures. The United States remains vast, diverse, and resilient. Its cities hum with innovation. Its universities push the boundaries of science. Its culture influences the globe. It is a nation of contradictions, wealthy yet unequal, powerful yet vulnerable, divided yet bound by a shared experiment. Its flag has flown on the moon. Its music plays in every corner of the earth. Its technology shapes daily life worldwide. Few nations carry such reach, fewer still carry such complexity. Looking back, the arc of America's story is one of persistence. It has stumbled, fractured, and nearly broken, yet it has endured. The revolutionaries at Independence Hall could not have imagined satellites, skyscrapers, or smartphones, but they understood struggle. They knew that democracy was not a finished structure, but a framework, one that must be rebuilt with every generation. That truth remains as urgent now as it was in 1776. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but the story of America reminds us of something deeper. A nation is not defined only by its triumphs or failures, but by its willingness to keep trying, to wrestle with its contradictions, to press forward even when divided. The United States is not a perfect union, but a striving one. Its chapters are written in courage and compromise, in protest and progress, in dreams pursued and promises broken. And its story is still unfolding. The Republic, fragile at birth, scarred by slavery, tested by war, stretched by expansion, humbled by depression, strengthened by innovation, and challenged by division, remains alive. Its future is not fixed. It will be shaped by those who demand better, by those who insist that liberty must be lived as well as promised. The story of the United States is not finished. It continues, carried by millions of voices, choices, and dreams, a story still unfolding, line by line, year by year, into the unknown horizon.